As the Roman Empire struggled against its own failing institutions, and its armies tore one another to shreds on battlefields ranging from the forests of the Rhineland to the hot deserts of Syria, the empire's old enemies stirred. The Germanic barbarians, long a thorn in Rome's side, were in the midst of a great period of change and upheaval in their cold, forested homeland. Driven by climate change, rival peoples competing for resources, and the promise of wealth in the borderlands of the Roman Empire, the Germans began migrating en masse to the Rhine-Danube frontier, and those tribes who saw the chance broke over that border and raided Roman territory. In the ever-changing network of tribal client kings along the Roman border, new tribes and confederations rose and fell with alarming frequency. Over time, tribes with more familiar names like Goths, Franks, Alemanni, and Vandals rose to the top of the pecking order, and these were the tribes that would seize territory from Rome as the empire began to crumble. But that was still a ways off. Out east, things were changing as well. For centuries, the Iranian plateau had been dominated by the Parthians. The empire claimed to be the successor to the Persian Empire of old, but that was not the case. The Parthians were people from further north, who conquered the Iranian plateau as, ostensibly, a vassal of the crumbling Seleucid Empire. But even after they had gained full control over most of what had been the Achaemenid Empire, the Parthians still maintained the Hellenistic style of Seleucid rule, mixed with elements of their old tribal nomadic government. But, just like all other empires, the Parthians started to encounter troubles in the 3rd century, and became divided internally. A family of bureaucrats and priests from the old heartland of Persia in the south would seize upon that division and weakness and rise to power, restoring a truly Persian empire. The new dynasty, called the Sassanids, wanted to make Persia great again, to restore the old imperial glory of the Achaemenid Empire before Alexander the Great ruined it. And the new empire had Rome in its sights. Restoring Persia's old glory required the recapture of the Achaemenids' old territory in Egypt, the Levant, and Anatolia. This is the story of how Rome's two great foreign threats arose in the 3rd century, of how the Germanic peoples that built many of the kingdoms of medieval Europe took shape, and of how an old empire at the heart of ancient classical civilization was remade as the classical period came to a close. Like in Rome, this is a story of transformation, albeit a less painful and largely more successful one. This is the story of how a new multipolar world arose as the old monopolar world of Rome's Mare Nostrum came to an end. We human beings are a funny bunch. Mixed up bundles of contradictions in spirit, as much angels as we are devils. And history is our story. It's the million little epic tales, of which yours is a part. The actions of our ancestors echo in us. The good, the bad, and the in-between. The past may be a different country, and they may do things differently there. But as a country, we've all visited through the same human drama that has been played out millions of times over thousands of years. And if we know where we've been, then maybe we'll be able to see where we're going. This is Renegade Historian, and these are our stories. Germany was always a bridge too far for the Romans. Beyond the Rhine and the Danube were vast, impenetrable forests filled with people who knew the land and who fought with such fervor that they dealt the Roman Empire some of its worst military defeats. The Germans had once destroyed 3 legions in a single battle at Teutoburg Forest, and forever drove them back behind the Rhine. Unlike with Persia, there was no state for the Romans to attack. There were no major cities. The Germans were a tribal people, internally divided and at war with one another, far more often than they were at war with Rome. While the migration period is typically associated with the 4th and the 5th centuries, the tribes had been moving slowly since the 3rd century, even earlier, perhaps. Tribes seeking wealth and greener pastures were slowly attracted towards the Roman border and the rich client kings who lived along it. See, the relationship between the Romans and the Germans wasn't always antagonistic. The border forts of the Rhine-Danube frontier were to keep Germanic raids out, yes, but they were also to watch over the trade that passed between Rome and Germania. Mind you, that trade was very lopsided. It was far more a case of Germans buying Roman goods than the other way around. Roman material culture found its way into Germany through both trade and as gifts to the Germanic warlords that lived along the Roman border. The superior quality and craftsmanship of Roman goods put them in very high demand among the Germans. And those lords along the border recycled those gifts to their retainers to maintain their power and prestige. But the effect was almost the opposite of what the Romans intended. The gifts were meant to keep Germanic warlords happy and convince them to stick to their side of the river. But it only attracted more Germans, who migrated where the wealth was. As the Germans living along the rivers raided the borderlands of the Roman Empire, they themselves were raided by Germanic tribes further east. They carried their ill-gotten gains off into the forest, and the Romans sent more gifts to the Germanic lords along the border. The circle of life, you know? And that system worked fine, until the 3rd century. The crises that racked Rome did not stay in Roman territory. The climate change that crippled Rome's agricultural output also affected the Germans, not just the ones close to Rome either. Germans living much further east along the southern coasts of the Baltic were also affected. But they also had to contend with rival people groups in the region, non-Germanic tribes like the early Slavs or horse nomads of the Great Steppe. The trouble with studying what was going on in Germany at this time is the fact that they weren't writing anything down. So nearly all of what we do know relies on Roman accounts, on archaeological data, and historical reconstructions, based on the movements of people that we know did occur, as well as later accounts that mentioned this period in German history. The problem with those is that they were written centuries after the fact, so their accuracy is suspect, to say the very least. Still, one thing we do more or less know is that these people movements were more than just men going off to raid and settle new lands. These were the complete uprooting and movement of entire people groups, women, children, elderly, and all. Likely, groups of all men probed a region before the women and children moved en masse behind them. The prime example here was the Goths, perhaps the most famous of the Germanic groups from the fall of the Roman Empire. The Goths actually originated in what is now Poland. They were just one of many Germanic tribes that lived along the Baltic coast, but over the course of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, the Goths migrated south. The entire people moved from their homeland in Poland to the Crimea, where they settled permanently. Some of them, at least. There were more Gothic invasions to come, but the people and the East Germanic language they spoke survived into the 18th century in the Crimea. Unfortunately, with the death of Crimean Gothic, the East Germanic languages are now completely extinct. The two offshoots of the Goths did not maintain their original language. The Ostrogoths would settle in Italy after the fall of the Western Empire and adopt a bastardized form of Roman Latin that, over time, and after more invasions from other Germanic peoples, became Italian. Meanwhile, the Visigoths would settle in Spain along with the Suebi, but their language holds relatively little influence over modern Spanish. A word here or there, but modern Spanish is a Romance language with some influence from Arabic. The Goths weren't the only important Germanic people to show up in the 3rd century either. The ever-shifting network of petty kings and warlords produced other tribes that have an outsized influence in European history. The Franks, the Angles and Saxons, the Vandals, the Alemanni, and the Burgundians, among others, being the prime examples. Germany was never a peaceful place, but emperors had done a decent job keeping the violence on the eastern side of the Rhine and the northern bank of the Danube. But around the reign of Marcus Aurelius, Germany's violence poured over into Rome, and in the chaos of the 3rd century, a number of Germanic tribes saw an opportunity to raid Roman territory for gold and glory. As I mentioned in the last episode, most of those tribes were eventually dealt with by Aurelian. But there were a few decades there where Germanic warlords could raid with impunity in Roman territory. Much like the Vikings would do centuries later, the best warlords capable of carrying off the most gold attracted the best and the greatest number of warriors, which allowed them to raid for ever more gold until they met with the sticky end that many raiders have throughout history. Overextended and cut off by a numerically superior force of the people they had been raiding. Not for nothing, but the Germanic tribes that plagued Rome in the 3rd century did follow a similar religion to the Vikings. The names of the gods and some of the details of worship changed as you moved north, but the religions were basically the same. Wotan and Tyr in Germania were Odin and Thor in Scandinavia. You get the idea. Before I move on, quick side note. Modern Germany has very different names across Europe. In English, it's Germany. In many Romance languages, it's based on the Alemanni tribe. In Polish and many other Slavic languages, it's Niemcy, from the Proto-Slavic Niemets. The Finns and Estonians call Germany Saksa and Saksama, which comes from the Saxons. People still refer to Germany from the German tribes they lived nearest to. Meanwhile, Germany calls itself Deutschland, which literally means either the German land or the people's land, something to that effect. Anyway, it would actually be the Germanic peoples moving forward who would have the greatest influence over Roman and indeed European history. For the next roughly 2 centuries of Roman history, the empire would grow ever more Germanic. Peoples from across the Rhine and Danube came in to settle regions within Roman territory. Marcus Aurelius had already set the precedent here for inviting in groups of people to settle depopulated regions. After all, Romanization had worked on the Gauls and the Celtiberians, the Illyrians and the Anatolians. Why not the Germans? The answer was that it did, but not in the way the Romans hoped it would. As time went on, actors like Attila the Hun accelerated Germanic migration. Whole tribes would settle in Roman territory as semi-independent federati kingdoms. The Romans would begin amputating outer territories for the sake of Italy. And even then, many high-ranking officials within the empire would have full or partial Germanic ancestry by the end. Flavius Stilicho, one of Rome's last true defenders, was himself half Vandal. These Germanic peoples wanted to imitate Roman civilization, but they didn't want to be ruled by Rome. Many adopted Latin as their language, which led to the formation of modern Romance languages. Roman symbols and titles were adopted as well. The eagle and the title duke spring to mind. Finally, there was Roman religion. The Germanic peoples weren't a monolith in terms of religion, and Christianity would spread into the forests of Germany, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's leave Germany for a bit and move east, where a far more pressing concern for Rome had begun to stir. In the Parthian Empire, many native Persians, particularly those in the old imperial heartland of Pars in the south along the Arabian Gulf, bristled at the Hellenic nomadic hybrid style the Parthians ruled with. In Pars, one family, the House of Sasan, rose to power under the leadership of Ardashir, who maneuvered his way into becoming the Shah of Pars. As a vassal to the Parthian Aracid dynasty, he expanded his reach to include nearly all of southern Persia. This didn't go unnoticed, mind you. Anyone who has ever played Crusader Kings knows it's a pain in the ass when one of your stronger vassals builds a power base capable of challenging you. But every attempt of the Parthian king Artabanus V to defeat this growing and unruly vassal failed, to the point of Artabanus's own death. He was killed in battle with Ardashir, who capitalized on Aracid infighting between supporters of Artabanus V and Vologases VI to solidify control of the south and oust the Parthians. At Ctesiphon in 224, he was crowned Shahanshah, the King of Kings, a title that went back to the Achaemenid Empire. After 400 years, the Parthian Empire had been defeated, and now a new, truly Persian empire could once again rule from the Iranian plateau. Ardashir spent the next few years putting down local revolts before invading Rome in 230. His attacks against his western neighbor didn't meet with much success, but neither did the Roman counterattack led by Severus Alexander. In 240, Ardashir died and was succeeded by his son, Shapur I, who continued his father's policy of rapid expansion. He conquered Bactria and parts of Roman Mesopotamia. It was Shapur who defeated Valerian in battle, dealing the Romans a blow they took a long time to recover from. On the home front, Persia prospered under Ardashir and Shapur's rule. Shapur built Iran's first dam bridge and founded several cities which attracted many religious refugees from Roman territory, in particular Christians who were able to practice their religion freely in Persia. While later Persian rulers would restrict these freedoms, Shapur's rule saw widespread religious toleration that wouldn't really be seen again until the early modern Netherlands, maybe the Ottomans. But they restricted non-Muslims far more than the Persians restricted non-Manichaeans, and non-Muslims in the Ottoman Empire were still forced to pay a tax called the jizya. That said, Shapur strongly favored Manichaeanism, and sent missionaries to spread the religion. The next few emperors continued the early expansionist streak, eventually gaining control over the whole coastline of the Persian Gulf, and extending the eastern reaches of their empire to the borders of modern Pakistan. The empire's influence, however, extended far further, into the deserts of Arabia, the mountains of the Caucasus, and even several of Rome's eastern borderlands. Though, when Persia and Rome actually went to war, the results were more often than not inconclusive. These were two of the three superpowers of the late classical world. When they fought, they were relatively evenly matched. For example, the Sassanid Emperor Narsa went to war against Rome in the mid-290s and the two great powers traded blows. The armies first met in Syria, where the open terrain favored Persian cavalry. Then in Armenia, often the battleground between Rome and Persia, where Roman infantry had an advantage in the mountainous landscape. The war only came to an end when the Romans captured Narsa's harem. The Persian emperor was forced to come to the table to secure the return of his wives and children. The Romans knew how to drive a hard bargain. Persia had to surrender 5 provinces to Rome, and a river border was established along the Tigris. And Rome expanded its influence in the Caucasus all the way out to the Caspian Sea. Narsa abdicated after that defeat and died a year later, leaving the throne to his son Hormizd II, who, in his short reign, had to deal with constant unrest until his death on a hunting trip in 309. After a brief period of chaos following Hormizd II's death, Persia entered a golden age and Sassanid culture, art, and religion flourished. In part, funded by the ancient world's mercantile superhighway, the Silk Roads, which connected Beijing and most other past Chinese capitals on one end to Rome on the other. As Rome floundered in the 3rd century and recovered in the 4th, Persia prospered and enjoyed the benefits of being the middleman on the Silk Roads. Merchants passing east and west essentially had to pass through Persian territory. It was the safest path to the great powers on either end of the Silk Road. And we know that both the Romans and the Chinese knew of a great power on the other side of the world who could rival them, and that they traded quite extensively. Roman glassware, for example, has been found in China, and we know the Romans had access to Chinese silk, much to the chagrin of conservative elements in Roman society who associated the fabric with cultural decline and general degeneracy. But, once again, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. To wrap this episode up, let's return to Rome and tie things together. What did this resurgent Persia and unstable Germania mean for the Romans, and how would they deal with them? In short, the way they always had. The same cultural hard-headedness and adaptability that made Rome the ancient world's preeminent superpower in the first place. And Rome's champion would be another soldier from the Balkans. Diocletian had been born Diocles in December 245, in the thick of the crisis of the 3rd century. He was from Dalmatia, which is modern-day Croatia, near Spalatum, called Split today. His name meant glory of Zeus, and despite the lofty image projected by his name, his origins were very humble. Like Aurelian, Diocletian wasn't born into wealth and privilege. His father was a scribe, or possibly a senator's freedman, so he was pretty far from wealthy and prestigious. So, Diocletian took the route that many a poor boy with ambition did, and he joined up with the legion. He quickly demonstrated a talent for both warfare and leadership, and progressed through the ranks. He rose to the position of general on the Danube. Then, in 283, just shy of 40 years old, Diocletian joined the Emperor Marcus Aurelius Carus in his campaign against Sassanid Persia in the capacity of commander of the imperial bodyguard, one of the most prestigious and powerful positions in the Roman military. The campaign went remarkably well, and within a year, Carus had captured Ctesiphon, the Sassanid capital near modern-day Baghdad, Iraq. However, the emperor would not get to enjoy his success for very long. Just after the capture of Ctesiphon, Carus died, having only ruled for about a year. It could have been natural causes, a lightning strike, or a bad war injury. We aren't quite sure. Regardless, Carus had already designated his sons as his successors and co-emperors. But history has a way of throwing a wrench in even the best-laid plans. One of Carus's sons, Marcus Aurelius Carinus, was already in the west, fighting the Germans. His other son, Numerian, was with him in the east. Both men were proclaimed emperor, but as the Roman army retreated from the front, Numerian died, and it very well could have been foul play. Numerian's father-in-law and prefect of the Praetorian Guard Arrius Aper was the obvious choice for his replacement, but the army preferred the rough military man Diocles and proclaimed him emperor. That was when he took the Latinized Diocletian as his name and proceeded to kill Arrius Aper in full view of the military. Diocletian laid Numerian's death at Aper's feet, in all likelihood to throw suspicion off himself. Little did anyone know at the time, but the man who would set Rome back on track had just come to power. With Numerian's brother in the west claiming he was the only legitimate emperor, there was a new civil war on the horizon. But Diocletian was the hardest man in a long time to hold the title of emperor, and he would finally put a stop to the crisis of the 3rd century. But first, he had a troublesome rival to the throne that he had to deal with. Though that wouldn't take long at all. Carinus was killed in 285 after a battle with Diocletian that Carinus had actually won. According to tradition, it was one of his officers that the emperor had cuckolded that killed him, but realistically, that guy was probably an agent of Diocletian. Regardless, the remainder of the Roman army accepted Diocletian as emperor, and Rome was made whole once again. But there was a lot of work that needed doing. Diocletian's first act as emperor was to cross the Alps and visit Rome. The Senate was a shadow of its former self, but it was still needed to legitimize a new emperor, and it could raise rivals if it really hated the next of these barracks emperors. In Rome, Diocletian played politics and made friends, earning the loyalty of the Senate for the time being, at least. But the emperor didn't spend that much time in Rome. He'd just brought an end to the crisis. There were no civil wars, no foreign wars, and for the first time in a long time, the empire was united under one man. And that man was dead set on a crisis like that never happening again. So he completely reworked Roman government from the ground up. Of all the emperors of late Rome, Diocletian had perhaps the greatest influence. Like many in the empire, he saw that Rome's problems, both foreign and domestic, were too big and too widespread to be handled by just one man. So he implemented what was called the Tetrarchy, or Rule of Four. The empire was divided into 4 pieces, with 2 subdivisions each. To the east was Diocletian's empire. He held Anatolia, the Levant, and Egypt, the wealthiest parts of the empire, as Augustus, with his capital in Nicomedia. Under him was a man called Galerius, who was his Caesar. He ruled the Balkans and Greece from Sirmium. The other Augustus, who still technically answered to Diocletian, was Maximian, who ruled from modern-day Milan and held Italy, Africa, and Hispania. Maximian's Caesar was Constantius, who held Gaul and Britain with his capital in modern-day Trier. Each quarter of the empire was split into dioceses, which is a word still used to describe the administrative subdivisions of the Catholic Church. In theory, the Tetrarchy would put 2 emperors in place to face each of Rome's trouble spots. Trier and Milan were both far closer to the Rhine frontier than Rome was. Sirmium was on the north side of the Danube, and Nicomedia was rather close to what would one day become Constantinople. None of them chose Rome as a capital, which speaks to how far the city had already fallen from prominence in the 3rd century. In principle, though, the Tetrarchy would allow Rome to respond more quickly to Germanic or Persian incursions, as each Augustus and Caesar had their own army, and could act with a degree of autonomy from the other 3. They also wouldn't be forced to fight on 2 distant fronts at once. What's more, although I admit it really doesn't seem like it would, Having four powerful men in charge of the empire was meant to ease the transition of power. Upon the death or retirement of an Augustus, his Caesar was supposed to take power as the new Augustus. It didn't shake out that way in practice, but you can see what Diocletian was trying to do. Also, all of the rulers of the Tetrarchy were, like Diocletian, career soldiers who had come from nothing. They weren't members of the elite insulated in Rome. They had grown up in the provinces during the crisis and were far more in tune with the life of the average Roman. New emperors for a new Rome. The four tetrarchs shared power. But to drive home the point that the crisis was over and that Rome was united once more, the Gang of Four portrayed themselves as identical in all artistic portrayals, and they always appeared together, watching one another's backs, and their relationships were cemented by marriage. Diocletian had Maximian marry his daughter to Constantius, and had Maximian adopt his Caesar as his son. Diocletian himself married his daughter and only child Valeria to Galerius, and adopted him. By 239, the Tetrarchy had become relatively stable, and Rome was on the upswing from the crisis. It was time to do what Romans did best: conquer. Diocletian reformed the army. The number of legions shot up from 33 to 50, but each one was smaller. This was the beginning of a transformation of the Roman army, from large field armies of the past to smaller, more mobile forces better equipped to handle Rome's long frontier borders. He also built a bunch of new forts to complement his army. One downside, though: he reinstated the draft and forced the sons of legionaries to become soldiers themselves, and that stripped the Roman army of one of its biggest morale boosts. Put bluntly, volunteers tend to be better fighters than conscripts because they actually want to be there. So, in the short term, it solved Rome's manpower issues, but in the long term, it made the quality and morale of the individual Roman soldier drop considerably. The next several years were spent in constant war with the Persians, the Germans, and more rebels than you can count. But by 298, Rome's frontiers were finally quiet. Peace had at long last been restored to the Roman world. But all these reforms and wars were beyond expensive, and the military reforms were just the start of it. Diocletian also doubled the number of provinces from 50 to 100, increasing the size of the government accordingly. Though it wasn't senators who got these new jobs, it was knights, or an early form of them, at least. Already at the close of the 3rd century, you can see the medieval world creeping in. Further irritating the senators, Italy lost its tax-exempt status that it had enjoyed since the empire had been founded, though the new taxes from Italy couldn't make up for the sheer amount of money Diocletian was throwing at the empire's problems. For example, the newly expanded army needed armor and weapons, so Diocletian set up state-run arms factories across the empire, and they worked. They were just really expensive. Part of the problem was that Rome's currency was basically worthless. There were more coins than ever, but some only had a purity of 2 to 3% silver. To address this problem, Diocletian formalized a change that I talked about last time. Many small landholders had traded their freedom for security from large landholders who became their landlords. And that's never a good trade to make. Not then, not now, but they made it. And Diocletian legally made these people tenants and tied them permanently to the land. Effectively the peasantry of the medieval era. It starts here. The Germanic kingdoms that would replace Western Rome just copied or kept the systems that already existed by and large. The fixed laborers were much easier to tax, and their taxes could now be paid in kind, with goods rather than with currency. Soldiers needed to be paid in cold, hard cash, though. So Diocletian also instituted edicts artificially fixing the value of coins, as well as wage and price controls, which Didn't work. They never do. The creatively named Edict on Maximum Prices fixed maximum wages and prices. Imagine that. The Tetrarchs justified this by vilifying what they called greed and profiteering, even though Roman merchants and tradesmen were just responding to market forces. Still, no matter how big the government is, it can't control all individuals. Despite the punishment for violating this edict being death, a thriving black market emerged for the 1,000 or so goods and services that fell under Diocletian's price controls. Sound totalitarian? It was. Under Diocletian, the office of emperor lost any republican shyness it had left. Diocletian loved wearing purple, the color of royalty. He wore gaudy jewelry and silk. His court resembled 18th century Versailles, far more than 1st century Rome. He also liked to use eunuchs, and Augustus would have hated it. He and his successors shunned purple and eunuchs as monarchical practices from the barbaric Persians. But the nouveau riche ruling Rome now wanted to show off. We're a long way from Augustus, and even further from the Senate and Sexemper Tyrannus. By Roman standards, Diocletian was a tyrant, but after the century of crisis the Roman people had just undergone, they overlooked that, and they took the security happily in exchange for their freedom. And, speaking of the loss of freedom, Diocletian's big government did what all large tyrannical states did, and they found a scapegoat, blamed them, and persecuted them. For Diocletian, that scapegoat was the Christians. This rapidly growing minority had picked up many adherents during the years of crisis, and they were less than willing to sacrifice to the pagan gods, which Diocletian viewed as a dereliction of duty that did nothing short of weaken the empire and cost it the favor of the gods. So, the Christians became Diocletian's scapegoat, and the followers of Jesus, already no strangers to persecution by the Romans, would experience persecution far worse than they ever had before under Diocletian. But that's a story for next time, when we will cover how Christianity reacted to Diocletian's persecution and came to rule the empire. Until then, I'm Renegade Historian. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and have a wonderful day, everyone.